What's going on, people? Welcome to Full Chest. Hope you're having a good day. Top of the day to you. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for clicking. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't done so already, kindly subscribe to the channel. Very much appreciated. Thanks for all the subscribers so far. Thanks for your comments, likes. Let's have the discussion, guys. So today, I'm going to be talking about tariffs. Why am I qualified to talk about this? It's my area of work. It's my area of knowledge, right? I've been delaying to talk about this because I wanted to get more information. So I'm going to talk about how the new tariffs affect African countries as a whole. I know that most people are talking about China, and it's all about China, the US, Canada, all that. But it does affect African countries as well. It doesn't only affect Africa as a whole, it trickles down to you and your pocketbooks. Whether you are a small business owner, whether you're a student, whether you're a housewife, whether you're a worker, whether you're a house husband, whatever you are, the tariffs affect you. I'm going to break it down from what tariffs are, how it affects the African economy as a whole, and I'm going to use Nigeria as a case study. So most of my points are going to be pertinent to the Nigerian economy, but you can as well put it, whether you're from Kenya, from Botswana, from Mali, Namibia, Zambia, you can also kind of use that to see how it affects your economy and you as well. I'm going to also go down to talk about everything as to some of the trade agreements that this affects when it comes to Africa specifically. So today's episode, I'm going to be teaching. And you're going to want to stick around because I'm going to be saying some things that you might not have known about. You're going to be learning. You're going to be getting insight on various things when it comes to international trade, tariffs, and policies that are pertinent to international trade. So stick around, man.
Let's go. Full chest. I go to war with...
All right. So welcome back, folks. So unless you've been living under a rock, you know that on April 2nd of this month, the Trump administration did announce tariffs on various countries. These tariffs were termed reciprocal tariffs. There's a reason for that. And it affected, almost every country, including African countries as well. So what exactly are tariffs? I'm going to start with that. Then I'm going to just go all the way down. So, and again, before I proceed, of course, there's been a 90-day pause on the tariffs going into effect. Why is there a 90-day pause? Are there negotiations happening behind the scenes that might, kind of determine how these tariffs come into effect? We don't know, but we wait. But before then, of course, let's understand what these tariffs are and how they affect your country on the continent and your pocketbooks, your money, etc. All right, so what are tariffs? So tariffs basically are taxes that a country imposes on goods coming in from another country. So what it basically does is that it encourages people to buy local. So for example, if you're in any country and you want to get an Italian car, right? It's gonna cost you almost the double of what you pay for a car produced locally, because it will include the tariffs, the import duties, and so many things. But in a nutshell, tariffs are created to encourage people to buy local because of the tax that the country imposes on those goods that are coming in from another country. So that's basically what tariffs are, if you were wondering. And again, just to break it down a little bit further, say for example, you're trying to order food from like your favorite restaurant on an app. Say you're in Nairobi or you're in Abuja. And when you're ordering the food costs about, let's say, 1,000 Kenyan shillings. But for delivery is another 1,000 Kenyan shillings. So all in all, the total for your food, the total price is going to be about 2,000 Kenyan shilling with the delivery fee as opposed to just 1,000 Kenyan shillings. Automatically, when you see, oh my gosh, it's another 1,000, you're going to be like, you know what? I'm not going to order delivery. I'm just going to walk down and get it and just pay the 1,000 shillings or the 1,000 naira or, the 1,000 kwacha, whatever it is in your country. So that's basically the idea of tariffs. That's how they work. Okay? So why did governments create tariffs in the first place? So like I mentioned before, they're meant to encourage people to buy local. So basically, governments put tariffs. The idea is that it protects local jobs. It would boost the local industries and the local economy and the local businesses, and that it ensures national security as well. But what tariffs usually leads to, de facto, is that it brings about higher prices for consumers, fewer options to choose from, and local businesses getting a bit lazy because there's no competition. When I was studying international trade, there's something I really loved, and this is one thing that Apple did. It's called creative destruction. And that is one thing that what tariffs usually lead to, is that, sometimes it affects creative destructions, which is pertinent to the fact that local industries might get lazy because there's no competition, and they don't produce great stuff. So ideally, that's what happens with tariffs. But governments usually have good intentions for them, but it doesn't really work out like that all the time. Okay. All right. Now, so like I mentioned, the tariffs are going to affect various African countries. But however, I'm trying to so basically when the US increased the tariffs on African exports, right, the goods become more expensive for American buyers. So what happens now, that it can reduce the demand, it squeezes the African exporters and lowers any African country's foreign exchange earnings. So when it comes to Africa as a whole, this is the effect that the tariff has. I'm going to repeat that again, right? So when the US increases the tariff like they've done on various African countries, and again, they call it reciprocal tariffs. So let me explain why it's termed reciprocal tariffs. The reason is because, I'm going to hold off on that. I'm going to get into that when I talk about the case study which I have, which is Nigeria. But in general, when it comes to Africa, right, the increase in tariff, what it does to African export is that the goods become more expensive. That's one, for American buyers. And it's not just American buyers, but for people in the diaspora. Say you're from Nigeria and you live in the US, for you to buy crayfish, for you to buy, some of those seasonings that you can only get from the country to make your pepper soup, to make your jollof, to make your, okra soup, egusi soup, they're going to be a little bit more expensive when you go into the African stores. Okay? So it makes them more expensive for American buyers, UK buyers, etc. It also reduces demand, right? So most of these African stores, if you're in the US, if you're in Canada, they might not be able to get this because they are expensive, and if they add the expenses that is due to the tariffs to the product when they put it on the shelf, you're going to be complaining that, oh my God, this is so expensive now. What is going on? You might not want to buy it again. You might rely on your mother-in-law who is going to be coming in Christmas or for summer vacation to bring the product instead of buying it from the local store in Ottawa. Okay, so it reduces demand, and again, it squeezes the African exporters, so they don't have enough products again to bring into the market, and then it lowers any African country's foreign exchange earnings, which affects the economy in general. So these are the impacts that it's going to have on all African countries. Now I'm going to go down and take a case study. I'm going to use Nigeria as the case study now. But like I mentioned earlier on, you can also use this point to rate the effect on your country wherever you're from on the continent. Okay, so let's look at the trade data, Nigeria and US. So in 2023, Nigeria exported 6.29 billion worth of goods to the US market, with crude oil accounting for $4.73 billion, gas $920 million, and fertilizer $167 million. Okay? Now, the US total goods trade with Nigeria in 2024 was around 9.9 billion, with goods exports to Nigeria being 4.2 billion and US goods imports from Nigeria being 5.7 billion. Now, all this data is on the TR's website. That is the the United States Trade Representative's Office, which is USTR. So now, to be more specific when it comes to Nigeria, so the US announced a baseline 10% tariff on all US imports with a 14% tariff specifically on Nigerian exports into the US market. The US tariffs on Nigeria are a result of its restrictions on 25 American product category, which the US views as creating trade barriers. Now, this brings me to the second point I wanted to make earlier, which is as to why the US calls this it's a reciprocity. So there are reciprocal tariffs. So if you haven't been in the trade world, a lot of countries, especially developing countries, through various schemes, are allowed to bring in goods to the US market duty-free for such a long time. And what these countries also did is to ban some goods from entering into their markets in order to protect the local markets. So basically, especially agricultural products from, say, the US, the Great Britain, these countries were allowed to ban them because it was produced in these countries, and to help local producers and local sellers not to compete with outside goods, they banned them. But de jure, legally, these are really trade barriers, but it was allowed by the developed world to allow developing countries to catch up. But the Trump administration feels that enough is enough and it's time to level the playing field, which is why he has indicated this reciprocal tariffs on a lot of developing countries as well. All right. So now some of the products, now to authenticate my point, which I've made earlier as to why some of this ban were allowed, and mostly because they're agricultural products. Some of the products that Nigeria banned includes beef, pork, poultry, fruit juices, pharmaceutical products, and alcohol beverages were all affected by the ban. So these are products that the US couldn't bring into the Nigerian market. Okay? Now, like I mentioned, the United States Trade Representative Office, USTR, pointed out that this ban on these categories are unfair practices and they are barriers to trade, which is the justification as to why the Trump administration believes that these tariffs are warranted, and which is actually fair and is true. Okay? All right, so now what are the impacts? We're going to get on the impact on this on African countries using Nigeria as a case study as well. So now, like I mentioned before, you can apply these numbers, you can apply these ideas to your country. I just want to be able to focus. That's why I use Nigeria. Also, my reason for using Nigeria is because I'm more aware with Nigeria's trade. I'm also more aware, and it's also interesting, the trade between Nigeria, because Nigeria's trade is mostly oil, and other stuff is not really traded that much, which is interesting, and which is why the Nigerian economy is weird, because there's no diversification, which again I'll get to, which is another impact that this tariff is going to have on the Nigerian economy as well. So as we keep on, just stick around with me, okay? All right, so now, in layman's terms, right, when it comes to this 14% tariff that the US has imposed, now just imagine that your landlord increases your rent by 14%, mainly because maybe you refuse to let your landlord park their car in your garage. All right. So because of that, he said, okay, because you didn't allow me to park my car in your garage, I'm going to put 14% more on your rent. And yeah, and then your rent increases by 14%. And that's what happens. But this is happening on a national scale and not an individual level. So just to put that in the layman terms, now if you live in Kenya, if you live in Botswana, the percentage 20%, 40% is the same thing. The same analogy applies as well. Okay. All right. So now, like I mentioned before, that there were trade schemes that various developing countries had in place with the US, which allowed them to bring in countries into the US market duty free. Now those trade schemes are going to be affected. And that is where the impact comes on African countries. One of those trade schemes, which I've worked on for about 2 years in the company I worked in, is called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. So for Nigeria specifically, Nigeria has benefited from AGOA since the year 2000. Now, other African countries and other developing countries might have developed longer than that, benefited from this scheme longer than that. But for Nigeria specifically, Nigeria has benefited from this since 2000. How have Nigeria benefited, and how has other countries benefited from the AGOA scheme? Now, let me explain to you what AGOA is. So, AGOA is a scheme that the US put in place that allows countries to bring in goods to the US market duty-free. That means that the US does not charge these goods coming into the market. So, these countries enjoy non-tax on the goods that they bring into the market. But however, to qualify for the AGOAs to participate in the scheme, all countries have to qualify, and their trade regimes have to comply with various US policies, whether it's human rights, whether it's things that have to do with governance, whether it's things that have to do with some bilateral trade agreements and things like that. And you have to qualify every 4 years. Countries will have to write petition. Countries will have to go for hearing at the USTR. I have worked with various countries on their petitions. I worked with various countries to get into the scheme. So this is how countries benefit from the AGOA scheme. Now, because of this tariff that the Trump administration have brought about, it's going to affect this scheme, and countries will no longer benefit from this scheme of non-tariff. So, back to Nigeria. Okay, so now, since 2000, Nigeria has benefited from the duty-free entry of products under the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Now, only a few of Nigeria's exported products into the US were subject to import duties. So that's tariffs. Meanwhile, Nigerian tariffs on goods on the US are around 27%, creating an imbalanced trade benefit. This is important, and this is why the Trump administration calls it reciprocal tariffs. It's because other countries, like I mentioned there, like Nigeria, they had a 27% tariff on goods coming from the US into the US market, while there wasn't any duty on Nigeria's goods going into the US market for such a long time. So Trump is like, well, it's time to even the playing fields. So we are bringing about reciprocity. Okay? All right, so moving on. So to add some beef into what I just said. So basically, this new tariffs is the Trump's way of basically retaliating. His administration, they call it, like I mentioned, reciprocal tariffs. And it's not just for Nigeria. So under the Trump administration, this reciprocal tariffs is imposed on, almost every country that have been benefiting for this imbalance of trades. Everyone got hit. What does this mean for the Nigerian economy? And I'm going to get into that. So like I mentioned before, this tariff is not on oil products. So the Trump administration did not put tariffs on oil products, right? So oil and gas makes up about 90% of all foreign exchange earnings and are completely exempt from the 14% tariff that the Trump administration imposed. You might be like, oh my gosh, that is great, since most of our exports to the US, since most of Nigerian exports to the US are crude oil. But no, Nigeria is not safe. The reason why Nigeria is not safe is because it's not just about the tariff, it's about the uncertainty that it has created in the oil market. Now, let me give you some points, right? So, these tariffs were announced on the 2nd of April. As soon as they were announced, crude oil prices dropped to a 4-year low of $60 per barrel. Now, the assumption that Nigeria had when it created its 2025 budget, which is at $37 billion with an $8 billion deficit, was based on the assumption that oil prices were going to stay at $75 per barrel. So with the tariffs, oil prices dropped to $60 per barrel, which means that Nigeria's national revenue assumption for 2025 has been messed up. Let me put it in lay terms for you. So it's just like assuming that you have your budget, right? And you budget that this year or this month, I'm going to be spending 20,000 Zambian kwacha, or 20,000 naira on, or you're going to be earning 20,000 naira, and something happens to your company, and boom, you're earning about 15,000 kwacha or 15,000 naira, which messes up your budget. Your rent, food, everything is a mess. Something always must give. So now you have to budget in another way, which is what a lot of countries have started doing. But I'm going to get to that as we proceed. With this, countries have to start managing their economy. Things are not going well. You have to balance the budget, make adjustments where necessary. Some people are laying off. Things are happening all over the place. That's how this tariff thing works. All right, so let's move on. All right, so now when it comes to non-oil products, when it comes to Nigeria, so some numbers, right? So last year, 2024, Nigeria exported non-oil goods worth about, say, $330 billion to the US. Now, all these exports were duty-free. Why? Because Nigeria enjoyed the benefits of duty-free exports under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which has been in place, which a lot of countries in Africa have enjoyed, right? So non-oil goods enjoyed duty-free exports to the US market. Now, products from the tariff-free entry that Nigeria exported to the US included cocoa, beans, soya meal, rubber, things like that. Cashew nuts, aluminum, and other byproducts of rubber. With this new 14% tariff, those exports are now less competitive in the US market. That is the biggest effect that this tariff has. If you're from Kenya, it's the same thing. If you enjoyed no tariffs on your exports to the US market, with these new tariffs, your products are going to become Kenya's products, Zambia's products, Mali's products, Botswana's products, South Africa's products, Uganda's products are all going to be less competitive in the US market because the prices are definitely going to go up. All right. And going back to Nigeria, my case study, this is very, very painful to the Nigerian economy because as a lot of economists have been saying, even good politicians, Nigeria needs to diversify its economy because the overdependence on oil is going to come to an end. And with these tariffs, this is exactly what it is. Nigeria is now going to pay tariffs to bring non-oil products into the US market as well. So it's painful. Now, why should you care about these tariffs? What is it to you? How does it affect you? Now, this is the huge part. I'm going to get into that now. Tariffs affect our daily lives in so many ways that we don't even know. It trickles down from the economy to the company and to you, to your family, to everything that you do to your daily lives. Here's how it affects you, right? So, if you work in exports, for example, so if you're in any country in Africa and you work in exports, what does that mean? That means that your bread and butter is exporting goods to the US market. What that means is that you're going to have to start looking elsewhere. Now, this point, I'm going to talk more about it when I talk about the silver lining to all this when it comes to the African economy. So you might want to stick around to hear about that as well. So the first point about how this affects your daily life is that if you're somebody who works on exports, you're going to have to start looking for buyers from other markets, from other countries. Okay? Second, food prices are already high. I have friends in Kenya, friends in Nigeria, friends in South Africa, in Namibia, in various parts of the world on the continent, even in the US. Food prices are high everywhere. The price of eggs are crazy high. And high tariffs worsens the situations. Because agricultural products that are imported are going to become more pricier as well. So, if, like I said before, if you buy products from the African stores, if you're not in Africa and you're in the US, in the UK, those products are going to be more expensive because now they're paying tariff on if the store is in America on its imports from the US. So it's going to be much pricier. Another thing is that it also exposes the fact that if a country has built, for example, like I mentioned earlier, a country like Nigeria that he's built his export strength on crude oil, those countries are going to be very vulnerable if your strength of your economy are just on one product and just on one country you rely on as well, which is the US market. You're going to be vulnerable as well. So that is how it affects the daily lives and why you should care about it, right? Going further as well, if you have investments as well, it's going to be affected. We all know this if you follow stocks. And like I mentioned before, it doesn't affect those in Africa, it affects those in the diaspora as well. Another thing I want to talk about is that what can you do about it? Because you might be wondering that, well, I can't do nothing about it. Let's see what's going to happen, right? But no, you can always do something about it. One thing that you can do is to protect your savings. You might want to consider diversifying, your portfolio if you're in the stock market or whatever it is, or the way you save money, how you savings accounts, things like that. But I think the major thing for me I want to talk about is that the way you buy things. You might want to be strategic in how you purchase groceries, clothing, and things like that. If you're planning to buy something expensive that's imported, like electronics, a car, computers, whatever it is, you might want to move faster now and buy it before these tariffs go into effect. Because if they do go into effect, everything is going to be much, much more expensive. So if you have a store and you sell electronics back in Africa, you might want to stock up now. You might want to do that. Because if you don't do it now, things are going to get much, much pricier. Now is also the time to look for opportunities. Various opportunities are now, because when the economy is down, if you have money, you can make some more money, because when it goes up, your money goes up. So, like you might have heard this, that in every economic shift, there are winners and there are losers. Businesses, who focus on right now, businesses might want to focus on local production, using local resources, benefits, and it's going to reduce competition. And you might want to keep an eye out, for if you're an investor, for opportunities that you can invest in now, because the prices of things are going to go down. For example, the Tesla stock has gone down. If you have money, buy the stock now. That's if you like Elon Musk. But it goes the same for every other share or every other stock. Things are down now. Get into the market, buy it. When the economy gets back up, the prices go up. You make some profit off of it. So these are the reasons why you should care, and this is how it affects you. But as a Pan-African, I always look at the silver lining. The silver lining on this for Africa and the economy is this. This is the time for African countries to focus on what we call intra-Africa trade. What is that? Trade amongst African countries. This is the time, or this is when there needs to be more talk of open borders, open travel, open economic ties, trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements within the country, multilateral trade agreements within the continent, regional trade agreements within the countries, and not just talk about it, but make it move, make it work, facilitation, reciprocity, proper negotiations within countries on the continent. It is now. African countries take advantage of this time, learn, realize that you cannot be dependent on outside. Now is the time to make sure that the continent is booming with trade and to find ways to make that happen. It is now. With this tariff and learning from it, African countries, economists on the continent, economists who advise presidents, you have to talk about intra-Africa trade, because that is the way forward, that is the future, and that is the way Africa is going to thrive, especially in times like this. Now, another thing is that this is the time, for investors. Investors who wants to invest in African resources, if they do want to do that, they must invest in local factories, create jobs, and add value before exporting. This is the time to advocate for that. There's always an opportunity. This is an opportunity for Africa. And this is the opportunity to promote trade on the continent. So guys, let me know what you think. I hope you've learned something about tariffs and how this is going to work. And as always, it's your boy. This is Full Chest. Kindly subscribe to the channel for more informative and educative content. All right, until next time, peace and love.